Have you ever felt like you're kind of like circling around a huge idea, you know, wanting to really get at the core of it, but without getting lost in the details?
Oh, yeah.
Like you want to understand something big and profound, but sifting through a ton of information just feels kind of overwhelming.
Totally.
That's what we are going to be aiming for in this deep dive.
Right.
Today, we're going to try to do just that. And to help us, we are going to be stepping into the intellectual world of a truly fascinating figure.
Okay.
And by doing that, we are going to explore a very fundamental question. What does it mean to act as philosophers in the world?
That's a good question. Because sometimes philosophy can seem, well, a bit abstract.
Right.
Like it's this very theoretical thing, removed from our daily lives.
Yeah.
But I think what we're going to discover today is how one of the Enlightenment's most dynamic thinkers, Denis Diderot, tackled these core questions about knowledge, about reality, about values.
Right.
And he did it in a way that was very much connected to the world around him, to things like art, science, and society itself. So think of us as your guides as we explore this rich intellectual terrain.
And speaking of the Enlightenment, when we think of French Enlightenment thinkers, one name just pops into mind instantly.
Voltaire.
Voltaire. He's like
Yeah.
that prominent figure. Everybody knew him.
Right.
But our source for today's exploration, excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Diderot, reveals him as Voltaire's intellectual partner, but in many ways, a more wide-ranging mind.
And, a more multifaceted mind.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So our central aim, our mission, if you like, is to take from Diderot's life and all those works some insights into what it means to act as philosophers.
Okay.
Diderot wasn't just an academic philosopher.
Right.
He was a writer, he was an art critic, a commentator on science, and he reflected on politics. His approach to philosophy was much broader than many of his contemporaries.
So now you might be thinking, why are we looking at an 18th century Frenchman to try and understand how to be philosophers today? Well, the Seppi entry kind of hints at this right away by telling us that Diderot wasn't a philosopher in that very narrow way that we think of academics today.
Right.
He was first and foremost what is known as un homme de lettres, a man of letters. He was totally engrossed in the world of writing and publishing of his day.
And so his inquiries were absolutely inseparable from his life as a writer.
Yeah.
And of course, his role in that huge encyclopedia project.
Right.
And this was more than just information gathering. This
Yeah.
was deliberate. It was ambitious. And it set out to change the common way of thinking.
And it was also a huge collaborative endeavor. And one of the most striking things about this encyclopedia was this ambition to elevate the knowledge of arts and crafts, things like weaving or carpentry, clockmaking, to elevate them to the same level of respect as that first philosophy,
Yeah.
those deeper, more abstract questions of existence. So they're really rethinking what counts as valuable knowledge. How do we value different kinds of expertise?
It is indeed a rethinking. And here's where things get even more interesting. The entry points out that Diderot's philosophical contributions are often overlooked by modern philosophers because his writings didn't really fit into our modern categories.
Right.
He didn't produce like a systematic philosophy the way, say, Hume or Kant did.
Yeah, so we tend to expect philosophy to come in these very neat packages.
Yeah.
Like a rigorous treatise or something.
Yeah, a very detailed critique.
But Diderot, he pursued philosophy through many different genres, including plays, art criticism, and prose fiction.
And so he was blurring those boundaries between philosophy and literature.
Yeah, and he was very conscious of the different genres that he was working in.
Yes, he was.
And he really experimented with these genres as ways of expressing his philosophical ideas. So this very act of pushing against conventional forms was central to his way of philosophizing.
Very much so.
And let's not forget the context in which he was working. Censorship in 18th century France, the old regime France before the French Revolution, was a constant threat to any writer or thinker.
Right.
So this definitely shaped the kinds of works he published openly and those that he may have circulated privately. So you can imagine how that environment kind of influenced the way his ideas were disseminated or deliberately not disseminated
Precisely.
at the time.
You have to look beyond those historical distinctions between Enlightenment philosophy and kind of what we understand today as academic philosophy. You need to embrace his more eclectic approach.
Yeah.
The entry even notes that while thinkers like Condillac, who is known for his, sensory epistemology, and Helvetius, who was a big proponent of utilitarianism,
Right.
they might seem more traditionally philosophical to modernize because their styles were more conventional. Diderot, his contributions, are often explored in literature departments or history departments.
That's really interesting. His intellectual curiosity was almost too broad for one category. But the SEP entry says that his approach resonates with the continental philosophical tradition, which tends to be more open to different genres, while also pointing out his naturalistic views that share some common ground with the Vienna Circle, a 20th century group that was very focused on science and logical positivism.
It's a broad span.
Yeah.
And it underscores how he just defies easy categorization. And it really suggests why this multifaceted approach to philosophy is still relevant to us today, particularly if we're thinking about how to engage philosophically with the world in different ways.
So let's delve a bit into Diderot's life, because as we said, he wasn't just an academic philosopher, sitting in an ivory tower.
No.
His life really shaped the way he worked. And the SEP entry divides his life into 4 key phases, starting with his early years in the 1730s and 40s in Paris, and the struggles he faced to kind of find his way as a writer in this very unpredictable world of publishing at the time.
He was basically living that kind of bohemian writer's life,
Yeah.
facing constant financial insecurity.
Right, but despite that, this period was crucial to his intellectual development. This is where he forms connections with key figures of the philosophe movement, people like Rousseau and Condillac. And he begins writing and publishing his own works, books that hinted at the more radical ideas he'd become known for later.
And what's so interesting is how these early works already show his interests. Like even in his translation of Shaftesbury,
Yeah.
he wasn't just translating,
Right.
he's engaging with these ideas like the moral sense theory, the idea that humans have an innate sense of morality, transforming them into a kind of aesthetics of nature.
Yeah.
Then there is the Pensée philosophique, which were these deliberately provocative pieces on matter and motion, nature, and the burgeoning science.
Yeah, and the Promenade de Sceptique, a philosophical dialogue that was actually published much later in the 19th century,
Yeah,
but it shows his engagement with skeptical thought.
absolutely.
Then there's also Les Bijoux Indiscrets, which the Sopki describes as philosophical pornography. So clearly he's not afraid to push the boundaries in terms of content and form.
Pushing those boundaries
Right.
from the start. But really, it all culminates in his Lettres sur les aveugles. This was in 1749.
Right.
And it is seen as an early masterpiece.
Yeah.
A really sophisticated text, and it really exemplifies that act as a philosopher. It takes this case study, the perspective of blind individuals, to explore some of those broader metaphysical and epistemological questions.
It's described as disarming in its exploration of Saunderson, the blind mathematician.
Yeah.
And it brought him recognition as a public intellectual.
Yeah.
He even gets praise from Voltaire himself.
Absolutely.
But that recognition came at a cost, right?
It did.
Because the authorities were already suspicious of him, after his Pensée philosophique. And then Lettres sur les aveugles really kind of solidifies his reputation as this subversive thinker, and he ends up imprisoned for 3 months in 1749.
Yeah. And that was the price he paid for challenging those established norms, acting as a philosopher in a restrictive climate.
Talk about acting as a philosopher in a challenging environment. But even imprisonment didn't stop his intellectual spirit. And the next phase of his life, his ascendance through this huge project, the Encyclopedia, begins almost immediately after his release.
This was the period from 1750 to 1765. This was probably the most transformative phase of his career, a great example of collective action in pursuit of philosophical aims.
Right. The Encyclopedia began as a translation project, but it quickly became something much more ambitious under the leadership of Diderot and D'Alembert, the mathematician.
The CEP calls it the single most transformative work of the French Enlightenment, and it went way beyond just a translation.
Yeah.
It was about promoting this new philosophy,
Right.
the
Yeah.
spirit of inquiry and reason.
Yeah, and the prospectus that came out in 1750 really lays out this grand vision. He didn't see it as just a collection of knowledge. It was a dynamic site of living thought, an engine to really change the way people thought about the world.
Yes. And he further developed those ambitions and those philosophical underpinnings in his article on Encyclopedia itself.
And it emerges at this time, mid-18th century, where there is a real surge of writing that is critical of traditional religious authority. You have this battle between skepticism and faith.
Yeah, the Encyclopedia fueled that dynamic.
Absolutely.
It became this weapon in the struggle.
Yeah. And it quickly attracts the attention of the religious authorities, in particular the Jesuits, who viewed this emphasis on reason and the inclusion of maybe controversial ideas as a threat to their authority.
Right. And so Diderot found himself having to defend the project
Constantly.
in pamphlets and other writings, demonstrating that engagement required when you're acting as a philosopher in the public sphere.
And it seemed like there was controversy after controversy, and things got even more difficult with events that weren't directly related to philosophical debate, such as the attempted assassination of King Louis XV in 1757. And suddenly, this philosophy, this critical philosophy, is being blamed for unrest and threats to order.
Exactly. And so you get this climate where the encyclopedia is seen as part of this dangerous encyclopedist party that's undermining morality and religion and the foundations of government.
And then D'Alembert, under this pressure, resigns as editor in 1758.
Yeah.
And Diderot is left with this huge responsibility of the project.
And then to make matters worse, Helvetius's De l'Esprit comes out in 1758. It was a very materialist work that argued that all human understanding comes from the senses. And although Helvetius wasn't formally part of the encyclopedia team, it added to this growing perception that there was something subversive about this new philosophy.
Right.
It was materialist, and the authorities were trying to suppress it. The encyclopedia gets caught in the crossfire. There are bans and attempts to shut it down.
And yet, despite all that, and through some very clever maneuvering, the work continues. And the entire encyclopedia is finally completed in 1765.
It was a feat of intellectual resilience,
Right.
real personal courage, and an unwavering commitment to the transformative power of knowledge. This perseverance is surely a hallmark of acting as a philosopher in the truest sense.
Absolutely. And with the completion of the encyclopedia, Diderot enters a new phase in his life, from 1765 to 1773, that the sect calls the years of celebrity.
Yes, finally a bit of liberation from this monumental task.
Yeah.
But remember, he had written thousands of articles for it.
Right. And it's a period where we see intense personal creativity, where he starts producing these new books, really going deeper into philosophical and literary exploration.
And his writings from this time reflect a continued preoccupation with fundamental questions. Like, what is life? What is liberty? Is there purpose? Is there an order in the universe? And could it be that it's a non-providential universe? That's a universe that's not governed by God.
Yeah.
He continues to explore these epistemological questions about how we understand such a world, particularly through these new biological sciences. Works like Lettres sur les sourds et muets, un pensée sur l'interprétation de la nature show this continued engagement.
There's also an interesting suggestion that he contributed to D'Holbach's Système de la Nature, a radical work of materialist philosophy published in 1770.
He and D'Holbach were certainly kindred spirits. Intellectually, they shared a lot of philosophical commitment.
Absolutely. And then there's Le Rêve de D'Alembert, this posthumously published masterpiece.
It's central to his natural philosophical work.
Right.
It tackles those questions of metaphysics, and natural philosophy in a very literary and engaging way through dialogue, which again shows that commitment to exploring these ideas in diverse ways.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that he considered it one of his favorite works, and even gave a handwritten copy of it to Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, along with some physiological fragments.
It clearly meant a lot to him
Yeah.
in terms of this understanding of the relationship between the mind and the body.
Absolutely. And then there's his work in theater. Now, he wrote plays, but more importantly, his writings about theater offered philosophical reflections on the nature and the limits of representation.
Right. And while his plays might not be that well known today, his reflections on the reality effect in theater and those underlying rational structures of theater are really important contributions to aesthetic theory. And it ties into his broader interest in how language and lived experience interact and shape how we understand the world.
And then there's his groundbreaking work as an art critic.
Yes. His salons, his reviews of the big Paris art exhibitions published in the Correspondance Littéraire were innovative. He combined the connoisseur, the esthetician, and the public writer. He reflected on art in relation to human experience, and he was asking questions about aesthetic judgment.
So he really invented modern art criticism as we know it. And through that engagement, he's constantly returning to those core themes.
Yes, he is.
Form and content, the artist, the viewer, the subject, the object.
That's that fundamental problem of artistic representation.
Right. And then we have Le Neveu de Rameau, another masterpiece published after his death. It's often called his greatest and most enduringly influential work, and it blends literary fiction with this psychological memoir, social satire, and deep philosophical exploration of perception and being.
It's a very unique blend.
The dialogue between Moi, who represents a conventional moralistic viewpoint, and Louis, who is the nephew of the composer Rameau, and he's dissolute and amoral, is just this amazing exploration of different perspectives on ethics and society.
It is really striking dialogue.
Yeah, and it's just, well, mind-blowing that this seemingly unconventional text had such a profound influence on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, one of the most important works in Western philosophy.
It really shows Diderot's ability to convey complex ideas through unconventional and engaging forms.
Right. And finally, we come to his twilight years, after 1773. This is where Catherine the Great becomes his patron and provides him with some financial security. And he continues writing and revisiting familiar themes, but also venturing into new intellectual territories, like history.
Essai sur le règne de Claude et de Néron shows his interest in applying ethical and moral considerations to politics and history. And his contributions to Renel's Histoire philosophique et politique des établissements et du commerce des Européens dans les deux Indes were also significant. It was a huge collaborative work, much like the Encyclopédie.
Right, and in it, he explored the role of commerce in shaping political and social change across the globe. So he's engaging with this emerging field of political economy.
Yeah, and his sections on the slave trade are very powerful, morally forceful, and proto-anthropological in their sensitivity to different cultures.
Right. It's worth noting that the Histoire had a lasting impact on thinkers like Hegel and Marx.
It really did.
And then there is the Supplément au Voyage de Bougainville, an imagined dialogue between the Tahitians and European explorers. Through this fictional encounter, he questioned the foundations of European morality and civilization.
And he anticipated that figure of the native ethnographer.
Right, and it's really interesting because in these later works, we also see his increasingly radical political views coming through. He was advocating for egalitarianism, democratic governance, and the abolition of slavery. Although, as the Seppi notes, political philosophy remained the least developed aspect of his thought.
Yeah. It's interesting that despite all of these contributions, he was kind of marginalized in post-revolutionary France. His materialism and egalitarianism didn't align with the political climate of the time.
Right.
It wasn't until the late 19th century that interest in his work really revived, thanks in part to literary scholars, historians, and even Soviet Marxists, who all saw something in his work. And now, in the 21st century, he's increasingly being reevaluated as a crucial 18th century philosopher.
So let's move on to these major themes that run through his work. What can we learn about acting as philosophers from his intellectual preoccupations?
Right. So the Seppi begins with his relationship with skepticism, his eclecticism, and his understanding of language.
Even in his early writings, like the Pensée philosophique and Promenade du sceptique, we see him engaging with deism, skepticism, questioning established religious ideas.
Yes, the design argument. The idea that the universe's complexity implies a divine designer. This is something he was questioning early on.
Absolutely.
And even as his views evolve, he maintains this skepticism toward grand systems, the notion of a perfectly ordered, divinely governed cosmos. He recognizes the limitations of human reason and the possibility of error. And this is a core part of acting philosophically.
And there's his eclecticism. He really resisted dogma and binary ways of thinking. He preferred drawing insights from various philosophical schools without being confined to any single one.
And this came from his understanding of the complexity of language, how it can undermine its own claims, and how different perspectives can illuminate different facets of reality. His use of irony and satire really helped him capture this complexity and resist easy answers.
What's often overlooked is the influence of Nicolas Malebranche, a 17th century philosopher known for his idea of occasionalism, which says that God is the only true cause. Now, Diderot didn't adopt this theological doctrine, but he was influenced by Malebranche's attempt to bring together skepticism about our senses and a commitment to scientific and mathematical rationalism.
So it's sort of Hume with Christian faith, where you have skepticism balanced by a belief in divine reason, access through mathematics. D'Alembert, for example, really embodied that mathematical strand.
Right. But Diderot, while he recognized math's power, took a different path and emphasized language in all its forms as the link between our understanding and the natural world.
Right.
And his concept of eclecticism was far more than just a simple opposition to dogma. In his encyclopedia article on eclectism itself, He connects it directly to the way we use language and how we argue in philosophy, what the SEP calls discursivity.
Yeah, he distinguished between syncretists, who just combine different systems without thinking critically, and true eclectics, who
Hmm.
actively take the best insights from different sources.
And he saw modern eclectics like Campanella, Hobbes, Bacon, and even Descartes as prioritizing experience and experimentation.
And this connects back to that essay form championed by Montaigne, right? Representing experience in writing and engaging with different viewpoints.
Yeah, there is a tension in Diderot's thought between eclecticism, which resists fixed systems, and his growing materialism,
Right.
which says that matter's the fundamental reality.
Yes. And even his early pensée philosophique, those fragmented propositions, can be seen as embodying this eclecticism. They offer up ideas for consideration rather than a unified system. And ultimately, I think this recognition of conceptual and linguistic instability is a crucial part of Diderot's thought.
Okay, so moving on, we see his radicalization of empiricism.
Empiricism being that theory that knowledge comes from the senses.
Right, and he was clearly indebted to Locke and those empiricist ideas.
Yeah, but Diderot takes those ideas to some very radical and surprising conclusions in Lettres sur les aveugles and Lettres sur les sourds et muets. He argued that our senses don't just give us information, they shape our understanding of reality.
Leading to, sensory relativism.
Exactly. He even elevates the sense of touch, calling it the most philosophical of senses, a claim that had atheist overtones in the context of Saunderson's pronouncements in Lettres sur les aveugles.
It really reverses the traditional hierarchy where sight was so often seen as the most reliable sense.
Right.
And in Lettres sur les aveugles, the blind man becomes this counterexample to the traditional argument from design.
Yeah.
The idea that the complexity of the world points to a divine creator. Diderot even links the blind man to idealist metaphysics because he's detached from that direct sensory engagement with the physical world.
And so, for Diderot, empiricism wasn't just about how we acquire knowledge, it shapes the very worlds we live in.
Yeah.
He famously reimagined Condillac's statue thought experiment,
Right.
and he used it to show how different senses create different worlds of experience. He's moving beyond that strict epistemological focus.
And through his work on the encyclopedia, he further transformed empiricism by really emphasizing practical knowledge and the arts and crafts, sometimes even equating this enhanced empiricism with metaphysics.
He contrasts experimental philosophy, the ongoing process of inquiry that doesn't start with fixed ideas, with rational philosophy, which tends to weigh possibilities and stop.
And it's interesting how he plays with this idea of experimental philosophy. He endorses it, but also uses it to critique the mathematicians who dismiss metaphysics. He suggests that these experimentalists might avenge metaphysics by turning the charge of speculation back onto science.
Yeah, and he introduces the concept of experimental metaphysics in Le Bijou and Disgrâce, a metaphysics based on experience, where all is experimental in us. In his encyclopedia article on metaphysique, he contrasts abstract metaphysics with a practice-based one, where musicians and geometricians should look into the metaphysics of their art.
So it's not a simple choice between rationalism and empiricism, or experimental and speculative philosophy for Diderot. He brings together empiricism, experimentation, and a willingness to speculate, driven by this need to analyze things that go beyond the senses, like the nature of matter and life. And he really preferred the concrete realities of the life sciences over the abstraction of mathematics.
And this brings us to his materialist philosophy, his engagement with science, and his concept of living matter.
Right. And it's important to point out that Diderot wasn't a formally trained physician or naturalist, but he had a huge engagement with the scientific knowledge of his time.
Right. He translated James's medicinal dictionary. He was crucial in writing those medical entries for the encyclopedia, and he studied chemistry, vital chemistry in particular. Later on, he said that he really loved reading medical books.
So his engagement with the life sciences was central to his materialism. But the plaquette points out that it wasn't just a straightforward application of science.
No, it was philosophical, it was speculative, and it was a dialogue with the science of his day. And it's important to remember that materialism, then and now, wasn't just one thing.
His natural philosophy is what is known as biologistic, emphasizing biological principles. He was really driven by this need to understand organic beings and their place in the physical world.
And here is where he does something really unexpected. He links the biological idea of epigenesis, the idea that organisms develop gradually, with Spinoza's substance metaphysics, the idea that there's only one substance making up reality. He does this in his encyclopedia entry on Spinozist. Wow. He distinguishes between what he calls ancient and modern Spinocists,
Yeah.
and he says that the modern ones, and this includes himself implicitly, believe that matter is sensitive. And he points to the development of an egg as evidence for this.
That's fascinating because Spinoza himself didn't connect his ideas to the life sciences in such a direct way.
Exactly. It's like Diderot's taking these vitalist elements, this idea that living matter has a force or organizing principle, and putting them onto Spinoza's concept of substance. He's connecting the self-organization of matter with this new kind of metaphysics. And the famous egg passage from Rêve d'Adalbert really sums this up. He sees matter as self-organizing and having these vital properties, a kind of materialism that's not just about mechanics.
And then there's the debate in Rêve d'Adalbert about sensibilité. D'Alembert, in his dream state, questions whether this idea means that even stones would have sensations.
Right. And Diderot continues to work on this idea of sensitivity in other works too, building on this theory where nature's constantly in this action and reaction at a molecular level. He's arguing against the Cartesian view of matter as inert and homogeneous. He says there's movement and sensitivity inherent in matter.
And so organic sensitivity becomes a key property of living matter, and maybe even all matter.
Right.
And he even draws connections between this idea and Aristotle's concept of entelechy, a kind of vital force, and Leibniz's theory of monads. But he does make a distinction between inert and active sensitivity.
So to sum it up, Diderot imagined the universe made of this living, sensing, self-transforming matter, understood often through chemistry. And this is a speculative metaphysics. The move from inert to active matter isn't something he saw through experiments, but it came from philosophical reasoning.
And we see this imaginative side of his materialism when he describes love to Sophie Volland. He imagines that the molecules of lovers will reunite after death.
And then there's that thought experiment in Rêve d'Alembert, where a marble statue becomes a conscious creature.
Right.
He's taking Condillac's statue and pushing it further, saying that all matter could be alive.
Now, how did Diderot understand the body and embodiment within this view of living matter? He rejected that abstract philosophical notion of the body qua body.
As he wrote to Sophie Volland, life is not just motion, it is something else. He's a theorist of embodiment. He emphasizes the living body's importance in shaping our experience.
And importantly, his materialism doesn't oppose the body to the world. They are not separate.
Right.
And Essek quotes Gaukroger here.
Yeah.
Gaukroger says Diderot pits the unity of sensibility against a Cartesian unity of subjectivity.
So there's a real emphasis on the embodied nature of experience and consciousness.
And it's important to understand that his emphasis on embodiment isn't an emergent view, where consciousness just pops out of matter, nor is it anti-reductionist, denying the material basis of the mind.
No, for Diderot, the living body and a reductionist attitude work together.
He famously said that the action of the soul on the body and vice versa is just the action of different body parts on each other. So he's reductionist, but not necessarily a limitativist about the mind.
He often replaces soul with man or animal, following a tradition that goes back to Lucretius.
Right.
And it's a challenge to explanations that try to understand things without considering the body.
And within this reductionism, we see a shift toward understanding soul in more functional terms and locating it in the brain. This is something that La Mettrie also argues for. And Diderot's own Éléments de physiologie and his remarks on Homme really emphasize the brain's complexity. It's a move away from the immaterial soul.
And he describes the soul as mobile, extended, sensitive, and composite, inseparable from the body. He increasingly saw the brain as the source of identity, but sometimes the whole organism.
And what's really remarkable is how he emphasizes the brain's plasticity, especially in his discussion of memory. This image he gives of the brain as a self-reading, self-organizing, sensing, living, speaking book is really an anticipation of how we understand memory and the brain today.
Now, despite this emphasis on the material basis of mind and body, he was also concerned about the implications of this view for human freedom and agency.
Right. As he said, every cause is necessarily followed by an effect seems axiomatic to me. This leads us to his complex views on determinism and the nature of change in a material world.
Okay, so all materialism in some ways is deterministic.
Right.
But Diderot's organismic view of matter, with its emphasis on activity and organization, led him to challenge those who, like Helvetius, saw humans as almost completely modifiable, based only on their sensory experiences.
And by rejecting this complete modifiability, he's defending individuality and self-determination.
Right.
He said that the differences in our organization give us an inherent way of being.
Yeah.
And he observed that people often prefer death to changing their deeply ingrained habits.
He also recognized this variation in traits like intelligence,
Yeah.
pointing out the differences in brain fibers between an idiot and a genius,
Right.
and saying that the differences between individuals are bigger than those between humans and animals.
And there's this anecdote of the cat falling from the roof. The cat always lands on its feet because of its physical makeup. Diderot uses this to show that individuals are shaped by their constitution and their drives.
Absolutely. And these deterministic leanings go back to that empiricist principle. Nihil est in intellectu quod non foret in sensu, O speaker.